Hey everybody. So one of my goals this year was to pick a topic that I was interested in, research it, and then present it to the team. And so I kind of came across and was interested in how CSS Grid worked. I know we all, I think, pretty much use Flexbox, but this is another potentially useful set of CSS that we can possibly use down the road. So what I wanted to do first was to kind of go over the terminology, some definitions. What is CSS Grid? What are some of the CSS declarations? Then kind of go into how to actually place items on the grid once you've created it, and then go through some examples that I kind of created, a couple of sites that I kind of recreated using Grid, specifically Atlas, and then the developer exercise that we hand out, just to see how we can possibly use this new spec. Also, take a look at a couple of examples of how we can use it possibly in the apps themselves. Look at some of the limitations, and finally end up with presenting some resources where you guys can go to check it out, get more information on it, possibly use it, or see how to use it in the future. So first thing, what is CSS Grid? Well, it's basically a two-dimensional grid-based layout system. It can handle both columns and rows. Unlike Flexbox, which is largely a one-dimensional system, although as you'll kind of see later on in the examples, Grid and Flexbox work well together. So the first thing you have to do is set your display, which in this case is display grid. Your grid container, and that's an element containing the grid defined by this display grid setting. As you can see on the right, it's kind of the setup we're going to use. The next, so everything within the grid are grid items. These are elements that are direct descendants of the grid container. So looking at example here, the header, the H1, the main, the aside, and the footer, they're all grid items where the div class site was the grid itself. So the grids are set up on with grid lines. They're either horizontal or vertical lines. So this is what separates the grid into the sections. And they are referenced by number, starting and ending with the outer borders of the grid. So in this example, we're looking at a 5x5 grid, but you're going to have 6 grid lines. And you'll see how those come into play a bit later. So it starts with the very first one and goes to 6. And later on, we'll also have a look at how they can actually be named for easier reference. And so grid cell, that's the intersection between a grid row and a grid column. It's effectively the same as a table cell. You can see the highlighted blue area there. That's one grid cell. That grid track, that's the space between 2 or more adjacent grid lines. The row tracks are either horizontal. The row tracks are horizontal, and the column tracks are vertical. As you can see here, it's the entire row or the entire column that represent the grid track. So next item, you can define a grid area, which we'll look at a bit later. That's a rectangular area between 4 specified grid lines. These grid areas can cover 1 or more cells. As you can see, example, this grid area here is covering 6 cells. Another of the terminology you'll see is grid gap. These are basically gutters. That's the empty space between the grid tracks. In the example here shown in blue, you can set the width of those. So now we'll actually move on to the grid lines and units. So the first thing that we want to define are, in this case, are the columns, and you're going to use grid template columns. This is what draws the grid lines. It can take a list of various different length values from ems to pixels, percentage, these FR units, which we'll talk about in a second, but these denote the distance between each line. So here, this what this is saying is this grid template column. So we're going to set our grid. Remember, we had set display grid on site in the example. So we're going to basically split this into 3 columns. One of them representing 2 FR, 2 fractional units. The second one is 1 FR, and the third column is also 1 FR. Do the same with our grid rows if we need to. This is set up this way, grid template rows. Again, this draws the grid lines. It again takes a list of the same length values, ems, pixels, percentage, fractional units, and again denotes the distance between each line. In this case, we are setting up 3 rows. So the first one is going to be set to auto, which is just going to fit the content that's in it. The second one is going to be 1 FR, and the last one is going to be 3 FR, which I think is what's coming next. We will talk about the fractional unit. So basically, the FR unit represents a fraction of the available space in the grid container. So if we're looking at this example, for when we're setting up our grid template rows, 1 FR, 1 FR, 2 FR, basically that equates to 25%, 25%, and 50% of the available space in our grid. We can also set a min-max on either the rows or the columns. It defines a size range greater than or equal to our min and less than or equal to our max. So in our example here, our first row is going to be, our first and last rows are going to be 1 fractional unit of what's left over each. And then our second row is can span from 10 ems to 20 ems, depending on the content. Another kind of value we can use is the repeat notation. It basically repeats the provided pattern a specified number of times. So if we were actually doing a grid-based design where the designers actually set it up into 12 or 16 grids or cells, we could put this notation in this example. Repeat to 1 FR. So basically we are going to repeat 1 FR twice. So basically that's the same as saying 1 FR, 1 FR, and then 2 FR for our third column. We can just simplify that and say repeat to 1 FR. Now, placing items on the grid, how do we do that? Well, so we've already defined in our grid, in this example, that we're having 3 rows and 3 columns. Now, with the declarations grid column and grid row, we can, these are applied to the grid items, and they place the items by actually declaring the start and end lines. So in this example, what we're placing here is going to span from grid column 2, the line 2 to line 4. So it's going to span 2 columns, and then it's going to go between grid rows 2 and 3, grid lines 2 and 3. So it's basically spanning 1 row, but here covering kind of 2 cells. I think I'm going to jump over to so we talked about that, grid gutters, repeat. The next thing we can do, we can actually name our lines instead of saying, the grid columns 2/3 or grid rows 2/4. We can kind of set up our grid. We can define, the header, we can define sidebars in this example, the main content, and the footer. And those are going to be denoted by the lines there. So basically, for our grid template columns, when we actually define them, we can actually, instead of saying 1FR, 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 we can say, okay, well, our first line is going to be sidebar start. Our second column is going to have 1FR, and then our third, the line is going to sidebar end, which can be simplified. So when we go into actually naming, placing it on the grid itself and our grid column declaration, we can just say from sidebar start / sidebar end instead of 2/3 or 2/4. And then, so I guess there was one other terminology back here that we can use when we're actually placing the items on the grid. We can use the span keyword. It's used to define how many grid tracks elements should span. So in this instance here, grid columns 2/3 span. We want it to start at line 2 and then span 3 columns. So the next section here, we're going to talk about grid areas, where we can actually define the grid areas. They are applied to the grid container, and it basically uses a text-based grid map to apply grid area names to individual cells. So in this case, looking at our example here, we want our top row to be the entire title. We have our main, kind of the first cell in the second row here. The header is going to span 2 columns. Sorry, the main is going to span the second and third rows in the first column. The header is going to span second and third columns in the second row. Our sidebar looks like it's just going to span 1 cell there, and same with the footer, but we can actually define these in this grid template areas. We'll get back to implicit lines in a second. Back to the other document. So our grid template areas. So, in this example, we are defining we're setting our grid template columns. So this is on our grid container. In this case, it is 2, 4, 6, 7 rows. So as you can see in our grid template columns, we have, the first column is just going to have 1 fractional unit, whatever's left over, and then we're going to repeat the following sequence. So it's going to be 10 pixels, basically a space, and 1 fractional unit. We're going to do that 3 times. So that's actually, you get 6 out of that, and then the 1 FR gives us our 7th column. Grid template rows are just going to fill in automatically. And now this is where we set down here in this grid template areas declaration, which is kind of like nothing else really in CSS. So basically we're setting each of the columns and cells. So we're going to say the header, in this case, is going to span all 7 columns. Sidebar left and right are going to span 1. Content's going to span 3. And then the footer is also going to span 7. So that's how we set up the grid template areas. So then when we actually go to place it in the place the content, we can just say grid area content. So it will span the entire area that we've already defined as content. So in this case, the 2 columns in the middle, or actually 3 because we put that 10 pixel column just as our space. I guess in this example it's using a column instead of gutters. You can go either way, but here you can see our 7 columns and our grid areas that are defined and how you actually place them on the grid, that grid area. So we have the header, sidebar left, sidebar right, content, and footer. And the only other terminology that we need to look at, so implicit lines. So if a grid item placement requires additional columns or rows to be created, the browser is going to automatically add implicit lines to keep the grid structurally sound. So if we've kind of set certain columns and then we add more content, it's automatically going to add columns or rows to keep it structurally sound. So now what I want to do is jump over into some examples. We'll start with the developer exercise, and you can kind of see it's basically looks like what we've all seen in the developer exercises that we've been that our candidates hand in. But we'll go through some of the code here to see how I developed this. There's a couple different ways you can do it. Well, I guess the first thing, basically you want to make sure that the browser actually supports CssGrid. The majority of them do. I think the notable exception is IE11, of course. So the way we check that, it's recommended we test it with the feature query at supports grid area auto. Now, if you kind of go out on the internet, a lot of people might say, okay, they recommend testing for display grid, which kind of makes sense because that's what we're doing. CssGrid, we define it as display grid. But apparently some older browsers actually have legacy support for the old CssGrid spec, because I guess this is a newer version. So this would actually test true, even though they don't support the new specs. So that's why we're testing with grid area auto. So going back to this example, and we'll jump into the code. The way I set this up, because we have the full width area here on the channel bar, we can't really just set a grid on this, our main container area. We have to set it on the entire, outer container. So actually what I did on this one, for each of the individual sections here, I've set up the same grid. So on the header, the nav, the main, the footer, we have display grid. We're setting it to have 3 columns. So the left and the right, which are basically the spaces outside of our content, are going to have equal space. And then our container inside, we're using the min-max, auto and for the min, and max up to 960 pixels, which is what the width of all the content is. So we're setting that on the header, the nav, the main area, and then all the content will fit in there. So as you can kind of see with Chrome here, it actually shows you the grid lines. Can't really point to them because I'm going to lose the focus there. But you can see it's kind of dotted lines. We can see our 3 columns. So the content in the header, our logo, our site name, search, all fit in that second column. And that's all set by this display grid and our 3 columns. So now we did the same thing with main. It's got the 3 columns for nav, and then main, and same thing for the footer. Now what I did within each HTML section here, I then broke those areas up into another grid, so we can easily place our content. So I mean, this is really powerful. You can nest grids and set up content the way you want to. So again, on GB header here, we're setting up display grid. We're setting it, in this case, I want 3 columns. I set 1 for the logo, 1 for the site name, and then 1 for our MyStar area on the right. I also set it up so the columns in this case, I set it with pixels. The first column is going to be 120 pixels wide, second is 210, and then the middle column is just what's left over. We're going to set it up to have 2 rows so that we can space the 2 site name tags here as independent units. So then going further into GB logo, we can see, so now, okay, well, we have to set all of these items on the grid. So how do we do that? Well, in this instance, with this example, so our GB logo, we use the CSS here, grid row. It's going to extend from row line 1 to line 3. I know we have 2 rows, but remember each one has a line, so it's actually 1 more than however many rows or columns we have. So we actually have 3 grid lines. So it's going to span basically the whole thing. And in this example, I'm just using the numbers. You'll see some examples later on where I actually name them, name the areas, name the lines. So this is spanning from grid row 1 to grid row 3. Our site name 1 here, if we click into that, we are only going from grid row 1 to grid row 2. We just want it in that first cell. And again, a lot of these items, Flexbox goes really well with grid. You can use them in combination. So again, here I'm in this instance using display flex and setting it to flex end so that it sits to the bottom of the column or of the cell. And I'll kind of do the opposite in GB site name 2. We have it set to go from grid row 2 to grid row 3, so that's our second cell here. And then I've had it, again, display flex and align items flex start, so it kind of sets towards the middle, the top of this container. So it fits a little better. And then GB search is set up again to span the 2 cells. So we're going from grid row 1 to grid row 3. And again, just using Flexbox to center it in this example. So if we move down to our nav container, again, we had set that up as grid with 3 columns. GB channel list. Not quite sure why that's set to be grid column 2 and 3 because we only have 1 and 2 in this case. But in this case, you really, oh, sorry, grid column 2 and 3, right, I got myself confused. We're setting it so that it sits in the middle column. I was still thinking rows, since we only have 1 row, but we actually have 3 columns, so it's going, so in this case, there's actually 4 grid lines for our column lines, and this one is spanning grid column lines 2 to 3, so that's our middle section, our middle cell. And if we scroll up a little bit more, again, our main, shrink this up a little bit more. Our main section here, again, we set it to display grid with the 3 columns, the same, so it gets the same layout, the same width of the columns. Within HP content, I decided to, again, set it up as a grid because we have 3 columns. In this case, using, for grid template columns, using the repeat keyword. So we're basically going to repeat 1FR 3 times, which is the same as 1FR, 1FR, 1FR. Going to make it 2 rows. It's basically 1 row for our rotator and 1 row for the second section down here. And that's just set them both to auto. And here I actually named my areas. So we have 3 columns and 2 rows. So as you see here, our top column, rotator, rotator, sidebar. So our rotator is going to span 2 columns, and with our first row, the sidebar, as you can see here, is actually going to span our 2 rows since we have it on row 1 here and row 2 in the 3rd column. Then our 2 contact columns below, we have column 1, which is this area, column 2, which is this area. They're both going to be in the 2nd row, but take up the 1st column and 2nd column respectively. And you kind of see that when we go into it more. So HP slideshow outer, which is our rotator area here. Now we can just say, hey, place this in the area that's defined with the name rotator. So that's going to take up what we defined here, which is 2 cells on our 1st row. So here, HP content 1, our 1st column of content, we set to say, take up the named area, column 1, which is, again, is just 1 row, 1 cell, 1 column here. Same thing with content 2. We've said match it to column 2 of our named areas. Now our 3rd column here, HP content 3, again, we wanted to take up the named area of sidebar. And going back to HP content, we named sidebar to take up column 3, basically the entire column 3, and extend from row 1 to row 2. So take up both rows. And just by naming that, that's going to take up that entire column there. And as you can see, by using grid, you get equal heights, just as you do for Flexbox, which is another advantage. And then if we go down to our footer, again, we set it up for the 3 columns here as we did back in the beginning. And again, for this exercise, I set GB footer as well to display grid. So we have a nested grid here, again, with 3 columns, just as an example of what we can do. Again, we're setting it to say, repeat 1FR 3 times. So it's going to take up 33% for each of the columns. And if we look at our GB footer items, GB footer 1 is going to span, again, I did it this way just as an example, our column row or our column lines from line 1 to line 2, logo, which is where it would go from line 2 to line 3, and GB footer 2 to go from line 3 to line 4. So it's actually really simple to set these up. I mean, once you understand it, you could just kind of plop things anywhere. Now, the only thing I would do different, if we didn't have the full, I mean, this is good for kind of the full width, the full bleed layouts, where it needs to go the entire column, or the entire width of the browser, you would set your outer grids to match, for each of your rows that you have. The way we kind of did it here with the header, nav, main, and footer. If we didn't need them to go full width, then we would just set up actually, the HTML would be different, but we would have, maybe on, if we had GB page in, it would be our content or GB content, something like that. We could just set up the grid there, and then each section we would define or set our items to the rows and the columns on the main grid. So the other example I had was kind of recreated Atlas, which honestly is a very similar structure, but just looking at this code, I don't think I did it much differently. Again, I set up the header, nav, main, and footer to be display grid. Again, we have our outer columns, 1FR, 1FR, and then our main content column. In this case, is set to max 1200 pixels. I guess I didn't have a GB MyStar outer in this one. So GB header, we nested another grid in here, doing it very similar. We have our 3 columns, only 1 row. our GB logo. Okay, right. So GB header is set to grid column 2 and 3. Our GB logo just kind of goes into the first cell, GB site name. Goes in the second, and global icons are going into the third. Our nav container, again, same thing. Grid, GB channel list is set from main line, or from line 2 to 3 in our columns. We have 4 lines, so it's going to go in the middle column. Main, again, we're setting up as a grid with the 3 columns. HP content, very similar. We're setting up a nested grid here. Again, 3 columns, but this time defining 3 rows. So again, going the approach of the named areas. So again, rotator is going to take up 2, sidebar is going to take up 1, but it's going to take up 3 columns. And if you look at our main app area here, is going to actually take up 2 columns. And then in our third row, our column 1 is going to take up 1 cell in our third column. Or content 2 is going to take up the second cell in our third row. And here we can see HP content 3 is actually taking up the entire sidebar, all 3 rows of our third column. And then I think the footer, again, is the same way, the 3 columns. And then within, we have GB footer top is spanning lines 2 to 3. Same with GB footer bottom, lines 2 to 3. And then GB footer 1. And again, here you can see using a combination of Flexbox. So instead of naming the areas or setting up another grid, we could do it this way, where we just set the content to display flex, and obviously it sets them in line with one another. We don't actually have to put them on grid, on a grid. In this instance, just another example of how they can work together. And then I think, again, yeah, GB footer bottom, again, is display flex, with our GB footer bottoms just sitting far right with margin left auto. So yeah, so a bunch of different combinations here that we can use, if we want to, with CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox or Flexbox combinations. So those are a couple examples. I also wanted to just show, I actually used Grid on a couple of our apps. So if we look at headlines and features, where one of our sometimes design struggles is, we have to have the content just stay on the right column, and not wrap around the image. So instead of actually adding a an outer wrapper, we can actually just on a UI article, we can actually set that to display grid. We can tell it, okay, in this case, we just, whatever content are in the 2 columns here, they're just going to take up the space that they take up with auto. Then inside, we can say, okay, well, we want our UI article thumb to span both rows. And we did that here in this case by using the line numbers. So our grid rows, we're going to go from line 1 to line 3, taking up 2 cells. Our UI article title, I think just implicitly goes in the first cell. UI article description here we've set to say, okay, well, we want it in the second column in our second row, and we again did that by using the grid line numbers, grid column 2 to 3. So this way, you know, this article description is just going to extend in this cell, since we set it to auto, you know, and it's not going to wrap around the image if that's what the design calls for. And we didn't need the extra div, you know, the outside wrapper to make that happen. We actually just did it with grid itself. So this may be a more practical application for where maybe we want to use CSS Grid. I also applied it to the calendar, our upcoming events app. Again, on upcoming column container, have it set to grid. In this instance, we're making our upcoming column left 30 pixels, and then our auto, so our second column, is going to take up the remainder of the space. And again, just one row. So our upcoming column left, again, just using the line numbers, is going to take up, you know, from grid row, it's from line 1 to line 3. Well, that probably should say line 2. Not quite sure what it's picking up here as the second column. But yeah, that should say grid line or grid row 1 to 2. And then our upcoming column right is just filling in that space. We don't even have to name it. It just automatically fills it. So again, this might be another instance where we can use grid with the apps and just align them. You know, obviously you could use Flexbox again, but again, just another option we have to use grid. Another example. So I guess some of the limitations, I think I mentioned before, our IE11 does not like it's supposed to be prefixed. There's partial support for it. I honestly couldn't get it to work. So that, you know, this is something, you know, that being said, since we still have to support IE11, we may not actually be able to use CSS Grid at the moment until either we drop IE11 or it actually becomes supported completely there. It is supported completely in Edge, Firefox, Chrome, you know, just about everywhere else, again, except for IE. You know, unless, you know, we want to go into, okay, for everything else we use Grid, but then we'll fall back to maybe using Flexbox for IE11. The other potential problem you can run into with CSS Grid, obviously, when it comes to accessibility, and so you can place anything anywhere, regardless of where they are in the DOM, in the HTML. You know, we could actually swap columns on our, let's say, where are we at? HP slideshow outer. You know, if we wanted that to just be in our sidebar, you know, we could swing that over there. I haven't changed anything in the DOM, but now it's going to be out of tabbing order if we put it over there. You know, we could make our content, our sidebar in our content. Actually, what did we define it? Sorry, main app. You know, if we put it in main app, then that would sit over there. And because because we have, I think, HP Content Main also, the grid area main app, it just sits over each other. So again, more issues here. You know, it presents a problem. Yes, we can put them anywhere, we can do anything, but as far as for the accessibility and tabbing purposes, that is not obviously a best practice. You know, it would be out of tabbing order. So that's kind of the main issue you can potentially run into with grid, is, you know, it not flowing the same way as it is in the DOM. So that's kind of it for the demonstrations, for the examples, for the terminology. I did come up with, there's quite a few good sites. These slides I was using actually came from, you know, the course that I took in Lynda, or I guess whatever it is now, LinkedIn training that were accessible to. Two different cheat sheets, which I'll attach when I send this out. But I think probably the best resource here is this site, Grid by Example. It has so much in it: video tutorials, layouts, you know, how to get started, examples, you know, grab and go patterns, lots of resources, articles, tutorials. You know, so again, blog posts, codes. You know, it shows examples, you know, that you can just grab. You know, here you can see, hey, that's the normal defining a grid, A, B, C, D, E, and F. But okay, well, we wanted to switch some of the content around. You know, lots of different layouts that you can just grab and go, they say here. You know, we don't have to clear anything. So this is a really good resource if you want to just play around with it. Again, more examples, more patterns, you know, header, sidebar, you know, some of the different layouts that maybe we use, you know, these kind of simple layouts. Again, video tutorials, and then even more resources, articles about it. And then our good old CSS Tricks has a complete guide to grid. This is very well laid out. You know, talks about browser support. Again, can I use it there or not? Terminology, properties of the parent, properties for the children, you know, how they're used, different examples. So another good resource. W3C or W3 Schools has some resources here that you can play around with. Another good resource, and then came across this Learn CSS Grid. Another set of resources and examples. So overall, I mean, it was interesting to learn and see where possibly we can use it. I'm not sure with IE11 that we actually can at this point. Hopefully down the road, it's something that we can use in combination with Flexbox. As I said, you know, as you can see, they work well together. You know, maybe if IE11 gets support for it, then it's something that we can use. It makes setting up, you know, our layouts so much easier. We don't obviously have to float anything. It's even easier than Flexbox as far as setting up the grid, you know, with the rows and columns. You know, more the two-dimensional, whereas I said Flexbox is only one-dimensional. So hopefully down the line, this is something that we can use. But it may be a good idea just to, you know, with some free time, you know, dabble around in it, play around with it, get acquainted with it, because hopefully it becomes something that's more useful to us and our layouts. So yeah, I think that's everything. I will attach all these resources, the 2 sets of PDFs with all the terminology and examples. I'll attach those and send this out to you guys shortly. But in the meantime, enjoy your time off. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to everybody. Stay safe. And I'll see you guys in the new year. All right, talk to you guys later.